Hello and welcome to Are You RAAD? This video will highlight the key factors of allowability to consider when billing the AmeriCorps grants. This information will be useful when it comes to building your budget and considering what types of costs are allowable. The objective of this video is that you walk away with an understanding of the federal cost principles that we must adhere to and have a basic understanding of what can and cannot be billed to the AmeriCorps grant. The Federal Uniform Guidance from the Office of Management and Budget sets the criteria for allowable costs. I encourage you to pull up the actual regulation under 2 CFR 200-403. You'll want to be mindful of these criteria when building your budget, but also when it comes to supporting expenditures as part of the routine monthly reimbursement process. The AmeriCorps team uses the acronym RAAD to help us remember those factors of allowability to consider when looking at expenses. Anytime you're thinking about the AmeriCorps budget, you should be remembering RAAD. RAAD stands for Reasonable, Allowable, Allocable, and Documented. Let's break down these 4 points. A cost is reasonable if it meets the following criteria. It's ordinary and necessary for the grant, constitutes sound business practice, it doesn't significantly deviate from the organization's established practices, and it passes the prudent person test. So if you're not familiar with the prudent person test, it's a cost is reasonable if in its nature or amount it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made to incur the costs. You might also hear this referred to as the taxpayer test or the Washington Post test. Just imagine, would an average Joe taxpayer approve of how you are using these federal funds? So for example, while the purchase of a laptop would be reasonable in its nature, the purchase of a $20,000 laptop would not be prudent in its amount. So next up in RAAD, we have allowable. Expressly unallowable costs are listed in the Federal Uniform Guidance, but you can find even more specific guidance in the reimbursement instructions, which includes documentation requirements for various expense types and guidance for typical youth build expenses. And those expressly unallowable costs include alcohol, entertainment costs, food, including food for member trainings and service events, gift cards, member bonuses or fines, security deposits, since these are eventually due back to you, any interest, late fees, or finance charges. AmeriCorps program should have a cost allocation plan, which details how you determine the allocation of costs amongst various funding sources. If you do not have a written cost allocation plan, then you might be asked to describe how these costs are being allocated. Some of the expenses you incur may be entirely and specifically for AmeriCorps, since AmeriCorps is the only beneficiary. Examples of these include AmeriCorps signage, service gear, day of service expenses, and background checks. Some expenses will benefit the AmeriCorps project as well as other work at the Youth Build program. A cost allocation plan details the methodology for distributing the total amount of expense relative to the benefit received. Examples include personnel costs, travel, and any contractual or consultant work. And then you have expenses that are necessary for the overall administration of the program, but may not be readily identifiable as AmeriCorps expenses. Some examples include rent, utilities, and communication. So this is why a cost allocation plan is essential in establishing a consistent way of distributing costs. When it comes to billing the AmeriCorps grant, you'll need to provide the basis of this allocation. The basis of allocation really depends on what is appropriate for the administration of your particular Youth Build program. Some examples include number of active employees, number of transactions processed, or square footage occupied. For example, let's say you have rent in the amount of $5,000, and the basis of allocation is personnel costs across the entire Youth Build program. In this case, AmeriCorps takes up 20% of personnel, so the amount due to AmeriCorps for this expense would be 20% or $1,000. You can find a template cost allocation chart in your program's AmeriCorps Fiscal Dropbox. You can use this template if your organization is not able to produce a breakout of how those expenses are allocated across different funding sources. And finally, to round out RAAD, we have documented. So the headline here is that if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. You'll be required to provide support documentation for all AmeriCorps expenses on a monthly basis. Match support documentation is not reviewed on a monthly basis, but the program should be maintaining the same level of documentation. For more in-depth guidance on documentation, it's best to refer to the AmeriCorps reimbursement checklist and instructions for guidance on expenses typically billed to the AmeriCorps grant.